Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. I would love to chat today about a topic in audio engineering that I never felt very confident about, and that is regarding bit rates for different types of recordings. So yesterday I was doing some belated updating to the website, mywordprompts.com, for those who haven't visited us online, and I was looking at the size of the bucket where we store the actual episodes, and I noticed that it was absolutely massive. Well, in data terms these days, it's hard to say anything is absolutely massive without being exaggerating a lot, but it was large, and this led me to determine that the bit rate of 192 kilobits per second was actually unnecessarily high for a podcast. So I always wanted to understand, Herman and Corn, these different bit rates that we see. For podcasting, what I read was that something you can get away with stuff like 92. And I guess when we talk about practical bit rates, it's a bit like, you know, we'll find someone who can sell us an 8K TV that is in a 10-inch screen form factor, which is impossible for anyone to see the difference. What I'm saying is that I would always have thought that it's better to capture the highest resolution audio that you can, but there's no point doing so if it's just going to be data that no one's going to be able to actually use or understand. So beyond the podcasting use case, which is of course such a popular one, I'd love to understand, Herman and Corn, the different bit rates one might want to use for transcription, which is something I'm doing all the time, sending up voice recordings to speech-to-text engines. And there I think you can be even more conservative in terms of the bit rate that you use, as well as using mono. But for other uses, Herman and Corn, where the objective might be capturing the highest quality recording, maybe evidence capture, what are some use cases where those very high bit rates actually make sense? And if one just wanted to keep it simple and use an app for recording voice notes, I use ASR on Android. It's a great app. And you just wanted one general purpose bit rate that would be good enough, recording onto, let's say, MP3 as the codec. What would you recommend? And what are those edge cases where low bit rates actually make sense, beyond just being, you know, they don't just make the audio sound bad, but they actually have a specific reason for existing. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, when using those very high bit rates would make sense. Over to you two.
Herman, we have a very practical, technical question on the table today, and it is something that actually hits quite close to home for us. Our housemate Daniel has been doing some digging into the back end of the podcast, looking at our file storage in the website, and he noticed something about our audio quality that has him questioning our choices. We are sitting here in our stone-walled apartment in Jerusalem, trying to make things sound as professional as possible, but Daniel is looking at the cold, hard data.
Herman Poppleberry at your service. And yes, I saw that message from Daniel as well. He was looking at the Amazon S3 bucket where we store our episodes for myweirdprompts.com and noticed we are exporting everything at 192 kilobits per second. He pointed out that for a spoken word podcast, that might be a bit of an overkill. He actually sent me a screenshot of the egress costs for the last month, and while we are not breaking the bank, he thinks we are being data gluttons.
It is a classic engineering trade-off, right? Quality versus file size. Daniel mentioned he had read that 92 kilobits per second might be plenty for voice, and he wanted to know when those high bit rates actually matter and when we are just wasting space. I think this is a great excuse for us to really dive into the weeds of digital audio compression. It is February 2026, and you would think storage is free by now. But when you are serving thousands of listeners, those kilobits add up.
I love it. It is one of those topics where people have very strong opinions, but often those opinions are based on how things worked 20 years ago rather than how they work today. To answer Daniel's question, we really have to define what bitrate actually represents in a digital audio file. Most people think of it as a quality slider, but it is more like a data budget.
Right. Most people hear bitrate and think quality, which is true in a broad sense, but technically it is just a measure of data density. It is the number of bits that are processed per unit of time. So, if we are talking about 192 kilobits per second, that means every second of audio is represented by 192,000 bits of data. If you have a 30-minute episode, you can do the math. It starts to occupy a significant chunk of a megabyte very quickly.
Exactly. And the magic happens in the codec, like the MP3 codec Daniel mentioned. The job of that codec is to take a massive amount of raw audio data and figure out what it can throw away without the human ear noticing. This is called lossy compression. It relies on psychoacoustics, which is the study of how humans perceive sound. It is essentially the art of lying to the human brain so convincingly that the brain doesn't realize it is being cheated.
I find psychoacoustics fascinating because it is basically a way of hacking our biology. For example, if there is a very loud sound at one frequency, our ears literally cannot hear a quieter sound at a nearby frequency. This is called simultaneous masking. The encoder knows this, so it just deletes the data for that quiet sound. Why keep it if the listener's brain is going to ignore it anyway?
Precisely. And then there is temporal masking, where a loud sound hides quieter sounds that happen immediately before or after it. The bitrate is essentially the budget you give the encoder to describe what is left after all that masking. If you give it a high budget, like 320 kilobits per second, it can keep almost everything, including the subtle textures of the room. If you give it a tiny budget, like 32 kilobits per second, it has to start making some really tough decisions. It might start cutting out high frequencies entirely, which is why low-quality audio sounds muffled, or it might introduce metallic-sounding artifacts because it just doesn't have enough bits to describe the complexity of the sound wave.
So let us address Daniel's specific point about our podcast. We are at 192. He suggested 92, though I suspect he might have meant 96, which is a more standard increment in the world of audio engineering. Is 96 kilobits per second enough for a podcast like ours?
It is a bit of an it depends answer, but generally speaking, for a mono recording of just voices, 96 kilobits per second is actually quite good. In fact, many professional podcasts use 64 kilobits per second for mono. The catch, and this is the thing Daniel might have missed, is that we produce our show in stereo.
That is an important distinction. When you have a stereo file, that bitrate budget is split between the left and right channels. So, a 192 kilobits per second stereo file is essentially giving each ear 96 kilobits per second. If we drop the whole file to 96 kilobits per second in stereo, each channel would only get 48 kilobits per second.
And that is where you start to notice it. At 48 kilobits per channel, the S sounds, the sibilants start to sound a bit crunchy or swishy. You lose that crispness in the voice. It starts to sound like we are talking through a thin layer of aluminum foil. So, if Daniel wants us to save space, the move wouldn't necessarily be just dropping the bit rate, it would be switching the entire production to mono and then setting it to something like 80 or 96 kilobits per second.
But we like our stereo field, Herman. I like being in the left ear and you being in the right ear for our listeners. It creates that sense of being in the room with us here in Jerusalem. You can hear the slight reflection of the stone walls differently in each channel. If we went to mono, we would lose that spatial intimacy. So, if we stay in stereo, is 192 really the sweet spot? Or could we go lower without losing that feeling?
We could definitely go lower. 128 kilobits per second is the industry standard for a reason. It is the point where, for the vast majority of listeners using standard earbuds or car speakers, the audio is indistinguishable from the source. Going up to 192 is what I call the safety margin. It ensures that even if someone is a real audiophile with high-end open-back headphones, they aren't going to hear any compression artifacts in the high frequencies.
It is interesting that Daniel mentioned his housemate experience, because we are all living in the same house, but we all listen to things differently. I usually listen to podcasts on my phone speaker while I am doing dishes. In that scenario, I probably couldn't tell the difference between 64 and 320. But Daniel is often at his desk with those massive studio monitors. He is hearing every single bit.
Exactly. But then you have the use case of something like transcription. Daniel mentioned he is doing a lot of speech-to-text work lately. When you are sending audio to an artificial intelligence engine for transcription, does bitrate matter then?
That is a great question. You would think the AI would want the highest quality possible, but most modern speech-to-text engines, like Whisper from OpenAI or the latest Google Gemini speech APIs, are actually trained on relatively low-fidelity data. They are designed to handle phone calls, which are notoriously low quality. In fact, most of these models downsample the audio to 16 kHz the moment they receive it.
Phone calls are usually sampled at 8 kHz and have a very low effective bitrate. So, for transcription, you can be incredibly aggressive with your compression. If you're recording a voice note just to have it transcribed, you could go as low as 32 kilobits per second mono, and the accuracy of the transcription would likely be identical to a high-resolution file. The AI doesn't care about the warmth of your voice or the air in the room, it just needs the phonemes.
The only danger there is if you have a lot of background noise. If the bitrate is too low, the encoder might struggle to separate the voice from the hum of an air conditioner or the sound of traffic. It might turn all of that into a garbled mess that confuses the AI. So, for transcription, I usually recommend 64 kilobits per second mono as the safe floor. It gives the AI enough clarity to distinguish between a P and a B sound, even in a noisy environment.
That makes sense. Now what about the other end of the spectrum? Daniel asked about evidence capture or situations where you need a very high bitrate. This is where we move away from just hearing the words and move into preserving the reality. This is where we talk about forensics.
Right. If you are a journalist or a legal professional and you are recording an interview that might be used in court, or if you are a field recordist capturing the sound of a rare bird in a forest, you don't want any lossy compression at all if you can avoid it. You want what we call lossless audio, because once those bits are gone, they are gone forever. You can't enhance a low bitrate MP3 to find hidden details.
And that is a different world. That is where we talk about formats like free lossless audio codec or FLAC, or just raw WAV files. In those cases, the bitrate isn't a fixed target like 192, it is much higher. A standard CD quality WAV file has a bitrate of 1411 kilobits per second.
Compare that to our podcast at 192. It is a massive difference in data. But the reason you want that for evidence or high-end production is for something called headroom for processing. If I take an MP3 and try to boost the volume or change the pitch, I am amplifying the errors and the missing data that the codec threw away. It is like trying to edit a photo that has already been through a heavy Instagram filter.
Right. It is like trying to zoom in on a low-resolution JPEG photo. It looks fine at original size, but the moment you try to manipulate it or blow it up, it falls apart into blocks. If you are capturing audio for evidence, you might need to filter out a specific background noise or enhance a whisper later on. You need every single bit of original data to do that effectively. In fact, in 2026, many field recorders are moving to 32-bit float recording, which has an effectively infinite dynamic range. You can't even talk about bitrate in the same way there because it is more about the precision of the volume levels.
I also think about archiving. If we want this podcast to be around in 50 years, we should probably keep a high-resolution master file, even if the version we put on Spotify is a smaller MP3. Because who knows what kind of audio restoration tools will exist in the future. They will work much better on a high bit rate file. Imagine an AI in the year 2075 trying to reconstruct our faces from the sound of our voices. It will want all the data it can get.
That is a very good point. Now, Daniel also asked for a general purpose recommendation for an MP3 codec. If someone is just setting up a recorder for general voice notes or meetings, what is the set it and forget it number?
For me, if it is just voice and it is an MP3, 128 kilobits per second mono is the perfect balance. It is small enough that you can store thousands of hours on a modern phone, but the quality is high enough that it sounds professional and is perfectly clear for both humans and AI. If you are recording a meeting with multiple people, 128 mono ensures you can hear the person at the far end of the table without the compression smearing their voice.
I would agree, but I would add one technical nuance for the nerds out there: variable bit rate versus constant bit rate. We currently use constant bit rate for our show because it is more compatible with some older podcast players and hosting platforms. But variable bit rate, or VBR, is much more efficient.
Explain that, Herman. Why is variable bitrate better?
Well, think about a podcast. There are moments when we are both talking and the audio is complex. Maybe there is a car horn in the background, or we are laughing. The encoder needs a lot of bits to describe that complexity. But then there are moments of silence, or moments where only one of us is making a very simple sound. A constant bitrate file uses the same amount of data for that silence as it does for the complex speech. It is literally wasting bits on nothing.
So variable bitrate acts like a smart budgeter. It says, oh, nothing is happening right now. I will only use 8 kilobits for this second. And then when things get loud and complex, it jumps up to 256 kilobits.
Exactly. It averages out to a smaller file size with higher perceived quality. The only reason we don't use it for the podcast is that some very old web browsers or cheap MP3 players from 10 years ago get confused by it and show the wrong duration for the episode. They might think a 30-minute episode is only 10 minutes long because they are calculating the total time based on the low bit rate at the beginning of the file. It is a legacy issue.
That is such a classic tech debt problem. We are using less efficient formats today to support devices that almost no one uses anymore. But for Daniel's personal voice notes or transcription files, variable bitrate is absolutely the way to go. He should set his app to VBR high and never look back.
Definitely. And since he mentioned using an app like ASR on Android, most of those modern apps have a high-quality setting that usually defaults to something like 128 or 160 kilobits per second. For voice notes, that is more than enough.
I want to go back to the idea of the 92 kilobits that Daniel mentioned. I suspect he might have been reading about the Opus codec. Have you looked into Opus lately, Herman? It seems to be taking over the world.
Oh, I am so glad you brought up Opus. If we really want to talk about the future of this podcast and audio in general, we have to talk about Opus. It is an open-source, royalty-free codec that is basically the king of efficiency right now. It was designed to replace both MP3 and the more advanced AAC.
It is what YouTube uses for its audio streams, right? And WhatsApp for those voice messages that everyone sends.
Yes, and Zoom and Discord. The amazing thing about Opus is that it sounds better at 64 kilobits per second than an MP3 does at 128. It is incredibly efficient because it uses different encoding techniques for speech and music and can switch between them on the fly. If we were to switch our podcast feed to Opus at 96 kilobits per second, the files would be half the size and would actually sound better than what we have now.
So why aren't we doing that? Is it the same compatibility issue we have with variable bitrate?
Exactly. While modern browsers and phones support it, the RSS feed ecosystem for podcasts is still very much stuck in the MP3 era. Apple Podcasts and some of the other big distributors expect an MP3 or an AAC file. If you give them an Opus file, it might just not play for half your audience. We are waiting for the industry to catch up to the technology.
It is frustrating, isn't it? We have the technology to make the internet faster and storage more efficient, but we are held back by the need for universal access. It reminds me of how long it took for everyone to stop using Internet Explorer. We are in 2026, and we are still tethered to a format from the 1990s.
It is the curse of the successful format. MP3 is so universal that it is hard to kill, even though it is technically inferior to almost everything that has come out in the last decade. But back to Daniel's question about when high bit rates actually make sense. There is one area we haven't touched on: music.
Right. We have been talking about the spoken word, where the frequency range is relatively narrow, mostly between 80 Hz and 15 kHz. But music is a whole different beast. If you are listening to a full orchestral piece, or a track with a lot of high-frequency percussion like cymbals, the bit rate becomes critical.
Absolutely. Cymbals are the ultimate test for an audio codec. They are essentially white noise, which is very hard for a compression algorithm to describe efficiently. At low bit rates, cymbals start to sound like swishing water, or like they are being played through a metallic tube. This is called aliasing. For music, I would never go below 256 kilobits per second if I'm using MP3. Ideally, you want 320.
And that is why services like Tidal or the lossless tier of Apple Music are popular. Even if many people can't hear the difference in a blind test, there is a psychological comfort in knowing you are hearing exactly what the artist intended, without any bits being tossed in the trash. It is about the integrity of the art.
I think that psychological aspect is a huge part of the high bit rate culture. There is this term, audiophile, which often gets associated with people spending thousands of dollars on gold-plated cables. But in the digital world, it just means people who want the highest bit rate possible. And while I respect the pursuit of quality, there is a point of diminishing returns.
I remember seeing a study where they took a group of professional audio engineers and had them compare a 320 kilobits per second MP3 to a lossless WAV file. Even the pros struggled to tell the difference consistently in a double-blind test. Our ears are amazing, but the compression algorithms have gotten even better. They are designed to exploit the very limits of human hearing.
They really have. Which brings us back to Daniel's observation. If we dropped our podcast from 192 to 128, we would save about 30% of our storage costs and bandwidth. Would our listeners notice? Probably not. Would it make the show worse? Technically, yes, by a fraction of a percent. But is that fraction worth the extra cost?
It is a funny thing to think about. We are sitting here in Jerusalem recording this, and the data is flying across the world. Every kilobit we save is a little less energy used by a server somewhere. It is a small thing, but when you have millions of people downloading a file, those small things add up to a significant environmental impact.
That is the green argument for lower bit rates. Efficiency is a virtue, but I think for us, the safety margin is still worth it. We don't want someone listening on a high-end system 5 years from now to think, wow, those guys really sounded crunchy. We are building a library here, not just a temporary broadcast.
True, but I think for Daniel's use cases, he can definitely be more aggressive. If he's capturing evidence, stay high, stay lossless, use FLAC. If he's doing transcription or voice notes, he can drop that bitrate way down to 64 mono. It is all about the intent of the recording.
I think that is the key takeaway. You have to ask yourself, what is the life cycle of this audio? If it is a voice note that you will listen to once and then delete, 32 kilobits is fine. If it is a podcast you want to live forever, 128 to 192 is the zone. If it is a historical record, go lossless.
I also want to mention the sample rate, because people often confuse it with bitrate. Daniel didn't ask about it, but they go hand in hand. We record at 44.1 kHz, which is the CD standard.
Right? The sample rate determines the frequency range you can capture. According to the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem, you need a sample rate that is double the highest frequency you want to capture. Since humans can't hear much above 20 kHz, 44.1 kHz captures everything we can possibly perceive.
Some people record at 96 kHz, or even higher, claiming it sounds airier or more natural. What is your take on that, Herman? Is that just more bitrate waste?
For 99% of people, yes. Unless you are planning to slow the audio down significantly. Like for sound design in a movie where you want to turn a bird chirp into a monster growl without it becoming grainy, there is no reason to record at 96 kHz. It just doubles your file size for no audible benefit. It is like having a television that displays colors that the human eye literally cannot see. It is the ultraviolet of audio. It is there, but you aren't using it.
I think this is where the nerdiness really shines through. We want the best, but the best is often just more than we can use. It is like buying a car that can go 300 miles per hour when the speed limit is 60. It is cool to know it can do it, but you are never going to use that capacity in the real world.
Exactly. And for Daniel, who is looking at the bills, that extra capacity looks like a leak in the roof.
So, to summarize for Daniel and for everyone listening, if you are using an MP3 codec for general purposes, 128 kilobits per second is your best friend. It is the Goldilocks zone. If you're doing mono voice notes, you can even go down to 64. And if you're doing something that requires high fidelity or future proofing, don't just increase the bitrate switch to a lossless format like FLAC.
And if you are a developer or someone building a new app in 2026, please, for the love of all that is holy, use the Opus codec. Let us move the world toward a more efficient future. Let us stop paying for bits that no one can hear.
I wonder if we should actually try an experiment for our next episode. We could record it at a really low bit rate and see if anyone notices, or maybe just one segment. We could do a lo-fi segment where we drop down to 8 kilobits per second just to show people what it sounds like.
Oh, the listeners would definitely notice if we went that low. We would start sounding like we were calling in from a submarine in the middle of the Atlantic, but it would be an interesting test of our audiophile audience. I bet we would get some very angry emails from people with expensive headphones.
We should probably stick to our 192 for now, just to keep Daniel on his toes, but I do appreciate him looking at the numbers. It is good to have someone keeping an eye on the waste in our system. It keeps us honest.
It really does. It is the classic housemate dynamic. One person is making the art, and the other person is wondering why the cloud storage bill is so high. It is a balance.
Exactly. Well, I think we have thoroughly explored the world of bit rates today. It is one of those things that seems simple on the surface, but has so much interesting science underneath it. From psychoacoustics to the Nyquist theorem, it is all about how we interface with technology.
It really does. And before we wrap up, I just want to say that if you, the listener, found this deep dive into audio engineering interesting, we would really love it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. Whether it is Spotify or Apple Podcasts, those ratings really help people find the show. And if you are listening on a high-end system, let us know if you can hear the Jerusalem stone in the background.
They really do. And it is always fun to see what people think of our weird prompts. You can find everything we have ever done at myweirdprompts.com, including the RSS feed if you want to subscribe. We promise to keep the bitrate high enough that we don't sound like robots.
And if you want to send us a prompt like Daniel did, there is a contact form on the website. We are always looking for new rabbit holes to jug down, whether they are technical, philosophical, or just plain weird.
Definitely. Well, thanks for the technical breakdown, Herman. I feel like I understand our data budget a lot better now. I might even be able to win an argument with Daniel later.
My pleasure, Corn. It is always fun to geek out on the stuff that makes our show possible. Just tell Daniel that the extra bits are for artistic texture.
I will try that. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to my weird prompts. We will be back next time with another deep dive into whatever Daniel or you decide to send our way.
Until then, keep your bit rates high and your artifacts low.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.